It started with the flyers. They appeared overnight, stapled to telephone poles, pinned to bulletin boards, and fluttering under windshield wipers like dead leaves. They advertised a festival, the Harvest Moon Gathering, scheduled for the coming weekend. The name sounded charming, conjuring images of pumpkin patches, cider stands, and autumn cheer. But the flyers were off-putting. The design was stark, the text printed in thick, uneven letters that looked hand-drawn, the edges of the paper frayed. Most chillingly, the only image on them was an outline of a grinning, human-like figure with elongated limbs. No one in the small town of Ashfield claimed responsibility for distributing the flyers. The local government said they hadn't approved any such event, and the town's social media was flooded with questions that went unanswered. Still, curiosity brewed, and by Saturday evening, the park at the edge of town was crowded with townsfolk eager to see what the fuss was about. The park looked transformed. Twinkling lights were strung through the skeletal branches of the trees, casting a faint golden glow over booths that had seemingly sprung up from nowhere. Vendors sold treats that looked homemade, apple tarts, steaming cups of mulled wine, and caramel-dipped apples, but something about the food seemed off. The colors were too vibrant, the smells too sweet, almost cloying. Among the crowd was Lila, a waitress who had grown up in Ashfield and felt an odd sense of protectiveness over the sleepy town. She hadn't wanted to come, but her roommate Sarah had insisted. Sarah was the type to romanticize small-town life, always hunting for something authentic. Lila had agreed to tag along, more out of a desire to keep an eye on Sarah than any real interest. As the evening unfolded, Lila couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of her neck. The people working the booths weren't locals. In a town where everyone knew everyone, their unfamiliar faces stood out. They wore matching uniforms, dark cloaks with hoods that cast shadows over their faces, and when they spoke, their voices were too quiet, like whispers carried on the wind. When Sarah bought a candied apple, Lila warned her not to eat it. "It doesn't look right," she said. But Sarah just laughed, took a bite, and wandered off to explore. Lila stayed close, her eyes darting to the faces in the crowd. She noticed something strange. The more people ate or drank, the more their expressions slackened, their movements growing sluggish. It was subtle at first, but soon they weren't just slowing down, they were stopping altogether. One man stood frozen near the ring toss booth, his eyes wide and unblinking, the faintest hint of a smile frozen on his lips. A child sat motionless on a bench, her hand clutched around a melting ice cream cone, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Lila's heart began to pound as she realized she was one of the few still moving. "Sarah," she hissed, weaving through the now eerily quiet crowd. She found her roommate near the center of the park, staring up at a stage where the cloaked figures had gathered. Sarah's eyes were glassy, her face unnervingly serene. On the stage stood the figure from the flyers. At first glance, it looked human, but the longer Lila stared, the less certain she became. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head slightly too large for its body. It wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over its face, but when it turned, she caught a glimpse of its mouth, a wide, impossibly toothy grin. The figure raised an arm, and a low hum began to vibrate through the air. It was a sound that seemed to bypass Lila's ears and burrow directly into her chest. Around her, people collapsed to their knees, their faces tilting toward the sky. Lila grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked, but Sarah didn't budge. "Sarah, we have to go!" Lila shouted, her voice trembling. She tried shaking her, but Sarah only smiled faintly, her body limp. Panic surged through Lila. She looked around, searching for anyone else who seemed aware of what was happening, but she was alone. The humming grew louder, deeper, until it was almost unbearable. The figure on the stage stretched its arms out wide, and for a moment the lights in the trees flickered. In that brief darkness, Lila thought she saw shapes moving, dozens of them, their outlines just barely visible. When the lights came back on, the crowd was gone. Lila blinked, disoriented. The booths were empty, the park silent. Sarah was no longer beside her. She spun around, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Sarah!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty park. But there was no answer. The stage was empty, the grinning figure vanished. The only sign that the festival had ever happened was a single flyer fluttering in the breeze, caught on a nearby bench. Lila snatched it up, her hands trembling. The figure on the flyer seemed to grin wider now, its eyes glinting with a malevolent shine. As she stumbled out of the park, she realized the lights in the town were out. The streets were dark, the houses silent. She ran to her apartment, her chest heaving, and locked the door behind her. When she looked out the window, she saw nothing but an empty street. The next morning, the town was buzzing with confusion. No one could remember the festival, and no one seemed to notice the dozens of people who were missing. Lila tried to explain, tried to make them understand, but they just looked at her with blank expressions. Weeks passed, and the missing were quietly forgotten, as if they had never existed. Lila stopped sleeping, stopped leaving her apartment. Every night she heard the humming, faint and distant, as if calling to her. And every morning she found another flyer on her doorstep, the figure's grin growing impossibly wide. The small town of Black Hollow was already steeped in eerie legends, stories of shadowy figures lurking in the woods, whispers of disappearances, and strange lights in the sky had woven a grim tapestry that no outsider could ignore. But the tale everyone warned against, especially in late autumn, was the one about the Watcher of Black Hollow. They said it started decades ago when the town's founder, Elias Durham, mysteriously vanished. Elias had been obsessed with the land, claiming it was a sacred place connected to ancient spirits. When he disappeared, his body was never found, but soon after, sightings began. People reported seeing a tall, emaciated figure, cloaked in shadows, watching them from the edge of the woods. It didn't move, it didn't speak. It only stared with glowing, amber-like eyes. Those who saw it never lived past the winter. The warnings seemed like folklore, harmless enough to laugh off, until Leah moved into town. She wasn't from Black Hollow and didn't believe in its superstitions. She'd purchased a rundown property just outside the woods for a steal and was determined to restore it. The townsfolk avoided her, their polite greetings overshadowed by palpable unease whenever she mentioned her house. "Stay inside at night," one old man warned her at the hardware store. His voice trembled as he handed her a bag of nails. "And don't look at the woods." Leah shrugged it off. She wasn't about to let local ghost stories intimidate her. Besides, she had bigger problems. Her fixer-upper was falling apart. The roof leaked, the wiring was ancient, and the woods pressed up against her backyard like an encroaching tide. At night, the house creaked as if the walls themselves were groaning. It was on her third night in the house that she first noticed the figure. She had been unpacking in the living room when a movement caught her eye through the window. The moon was high, casting a pale glow over the backyard. At the edge of the tree line stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and unnaturally still. Her heart stopped. For a moment, she thought it might be a tree trunk or a trick of the light, but then its head tilted slightly, just enough to confirm it was alive. Her pulse thundered as she scrambled to the window, yanking the curtains shut. "Get a grip," she muttered, trying to convince herself it was just a deer or a prankster. But the feeling lingered, that crawling sensation of being watched. She checked the locks on every door and window twice before going to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she walked the backyard, searching for signs of anyone having been there. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate a trespasser. But as she turned to go back inside, she noticed something scratched into the wood of her back porch. 3 words, "Don't look away." Her stomach turned, and she bolted back inside, locking the door behind her. She told herself it must have been there when she moved in. Maybe she hadn't noticed it before. She spent the day trying to focus on unpacking, but her nerves were frayed, and by nightfall, she felt the familiar dread creeping in. The figure was back. This time, it was closer, standing just beyond the edge of her property. Its silhouette was sharper now. The moonlight illuminated its unnaturally elongated limbs and the faint glow of its eyes. Leah stared, frozen, unable to look away. And then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided forward, as if the ground itself bent to its will. Leah gasped and stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the curtains. But when she pulled them shut, the room plunged into darkness, and the scratching began. It came from the walls, slow, deliberate, as if long nails were dragging across the wood. It circled the house, moving from the back door to the front, then up toward the windows. Leah grabbed her phone and called the police, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what was happening. "It's outside," she whispered. "It's trying to get in." "We're sending someone," the dispatcher assured her. But Leah didn't feel any safer. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against her eardrums. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, the figure was gone. They found no evidence of a break-in, no marks on the walls, and no footprints outside. Leah felt like she was losing her mind, but the officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Stay somewhere else if you can," one of them advised. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "This town, well, sometimes strange things happen out here." Leah didn't sleep that night, and by dawn she had decided to leave. But when she opened the front door, her breath caught in her throat. The words "Don't look away" were scrawled across her porch in fresh dirt. Panic set in. She grabbed her keys and ran to her car, but as she reached the driver's side door, a shadow fell over her. She turned, and there it was, just a few feet away. The Watcher. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she remembered was its grin. Wide, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. When the townsfolk found her car abandoned on the road the next morning, they didn't need to ask what had happened. Another newcomer had ignored the warnings, and Black Hollow had claimed another soul. They never found Leah's body, but at night, when the wind carried just right, some swore they could hear her screams echoing from the woods. The town of Ravenswood had always been quiet, nestled deep in the mountains and surrounded by dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the biggest drama revolved around whose dog was digging up flower beds. But all of that changed when the bell tower started ringing. The old church at the edge of town had been abandoned for decades. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the bell tower had been silent for as long as anyone could remember. The townspeople avoided it, not out of fear, but because it was simply a relic, a forgotten piece of the past. Then, on a cold October night, the bell rang. It was long past midnight when the sound cut through the stillness, a deep, mournful toll that echoed through the town. People woke from their sleep, startled and confused. Some assumed it was a prank, maybe teenagers messing around. But as the nights went on, the bell rang again, always at the same time, 12:03 a.m. Claire, a college dropout who had moved back to Ravenswood to care for her ailing grandmother, was among those who heard it. At first, she brushed it off, but after a week of sleepless nights, her curiosity got the better of her. "It's just the wind," her grandmother said one morning over tea, her gnarled hands trembling as she brought the cup to her lips. "The old place is falling apart." But Claire wasn't so sure. She'd heard the wind howl before, and it never sounded like that. So deliberate, so rhythmic. She decided to investigate. The night was cold when she made her way to the church, flashlight in hand. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. As she approached the building, the air grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. The church loomed before her, its once white paint now gray and peeling. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound reverberating in the empty space. Her flashlight beam danced over shattered pews, cobweb-covered statues, and an altar draped in dust. The bell tower loomed above her, its stairs a spiraling path into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Claire began to climb. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, each one threatening to give way. The higher she went, the heavier the air felt, as if something unseen was pressing down on her. When she reached the top, she found the bell hanging in the center of the tower. It was massive, its surface tarnished and covered in strange, faint etchings that didn't look like any writing she recognized. But what caught her attention was the rope. It hung limp, unmoving. She reached out to touch it, but a sudden noise stopped her, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the stairs. Her heart pounded as she spun around, flashlight trembling in her grip. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no one appeared. Then the temperature plummeted and her breath came out in visible puffs. The beam of her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The bell tolled. The sound was deafening this close, the vibrations rattling her teeth and reverberating in her chest. She covered her ears, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor and stopped at the edge of the tower. In the faint moonlight, Claire saw something move, something large and impossible. A shadow detached itself from the wall, stretching unnaturally as it loomed over her. It didn't have a face, just two pinpricks of red light where eyes should have been. She screamed, scrambling backward, her hands clawing at the floorboards. The bell rang again, and the shadow surged forward, enveloping her. The townspeople found her the next morning at the base of the bell tower, lying in the overgrown grass. She was alive but unresponsive, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She never spoke again. The bell continued to ring every night at 12:03 a.m., and more people began to disappear. The ones who returned, if they returned, were never the same. The townsfolk started leaving Ravenswood, abandoning their homes and businesses. By the end of the year, the town was empty, the church standing alone, its bell tolling for no one. But on cold, quiet nights, hikers who venture too close to the ruins claim they can still hear it, a mournful toll, followed by whispers carried on the wind. And sometimes, if they're unlucky, they see the shadow watching from the bell tower, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to come too close. The small town of Ashwood sat at the base of a sprawling, forested hill, surrounded by dense thickets and a winding river that snaked its way through the land. The place was idyllic on the surface, picturesque even, but it had a secret the locals never spoke of. It started with the old train tunnel that cut through the hill just outside of town. It hadn't been used in decades, ever since a derailment in the 1950s claimed the lives of 30 passengers. The train, its cargo, and its victims had been consumed by fire, leaving little more than charred wreckage and a faint echo of tragedy behind. The tunnel had been sealed off afterward, its entrance bricked over and forgotten by most. But some nights, when the wind carried just right, you could hear the faint whistle of a train. Evan, a high school senior, didn't believe in ghosts or urban legends. He prided himself on being logical, rooted in science. So when his friends dared him to spend the night near the bricked-up tunnel, he laughed and agreed. "Fine," he said. "I'll prove there's nothing out there." Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a thermos of coffee, Evan made his way to the tunnel on a cool autumn evening. The town quickly disappeared behind him as he followed the overgrown tracks, the silence of the woods broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. When he reached the tunnel, he felt a shiver that he quickly attributed to the dropping temperature. The bricked-up entrance loomed before him, the mortar cracked with age and graffiti scrawled across the surface. He set up his sleeping bag a few feet away and leaned back against the wall. Hours passed without incident. Evan played games on his phone, texted his friends to brag, and sipped his coffee. The forest was eerily quiet, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. Around midnight, though, things began to change. It started with a faint vibration underfoot, like something large was moving deep underground. Evan sat up, frowning, but dismissed it as distant construction or his imagination. Then came the sound of metal clanking, rhythmic and deliberate, as if an old train were slowly approaching. "Okay, that's creepy," he muttered, his bravado faltering. He shone his flashlight toward the tunnel, but the light bounced off the bricks, revealing nothing. The sound grew louder, echoing in the still night, and then came the whistle, low and mournful. It was unmistakable. Evan's heart raced. He scrambled to his feet, backing away from the tunnel. A sudden, icy wind blew through the woods, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning metal. "Hello?" he called out, though he immediately regretted it. A flicker of movement caught his eye. From the cracks between the bricks, a thick black mist began to seep, curling and twisting like smoke. It pooled at the base of the tunnel before spreading outward, creeping along the ground like a living thing. Evan turned to run, but the mist moved faster, enveloping his legs. He tripped and fell hard, his flashlight skittering across the ground. He clawed at the earth, trying to pull himself free, but the mist tightened, cold and suffocating. The whistle blared again, deafening this time, and a light burst forth from the cracks in the bricks, a sickly yellow glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The clanking sound grew louder, and then, impossibly, Evan heard voices. They were faint at first, but as they grew clearer, he realized they were screams. Dozens of them, overlapping in agony like the passengers trapped in the inferno of the derailment. Evan's flashlight flickered, and in its beam he saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the mist. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into silent cries. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their movements jerky and unnatural, like broken marionettes. He screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the mist pulled him closer to the tunnel. The glow from within intensified, and for a moment he thought he saw the outline of a train, a massive, rusted locomotive hurtling toward him, its front ablaze. The last thing he saw was its headlight bearing down on him, blinding and merciless. When the sun rose the next morning, Evan's friends came looking for him. They found his sleeping bag, his flashlight, and his thermos, but no sign of Evan. The authorities chalked it up to an animal attack or a runaway teenager, but the locals knew better. Another soul had been claimed by the cursed tunnel. Now, when the wind blows just right, the townsfolk say they hear the whistle, louder than before. Some swear they've seen a faint light in the woods, like the headlamp of an ancient, ghostly train, searching for its next passenger. The town of Black Hollow was tucked away in a valley, its closest neighbor a good 50 miles away. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone waved to each other, and strangers were rare. But there was one rule that everyone followed without question: stay indoors after dark. The warning wasn't a suggestion or a superstition. It was a matter of survival. People didn't talk about why, especially not to outsiders, but the scars on their faces and the occasional whispers about the things in the woods told enough of the story. Megan had moved to Black Hollow a month ago, renting a small house on the edge of town. She was an artist, looking for inspiration in the quiet countryside. At first, she found the locals friendly, but guarded, especially when she asked about the stay-inside rule. "Just listen to us," the elderly woman at the general store had said, gripping Megan's arm with a strength that surprised her. "The forest isn't safe at night." Megan nodded politely, but she couldn't help her curiosity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Megan sat on her porch, sketching the darkening forest. A faint breeze rustled the trees, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the quiet that had suddenly fallen. No breeze, no cicadas, just silence. She looked up, the pencil slipping from her hand. The forest seemed different. The shadows between the trees appeared darker, shifting unnaturally. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it didn't come from her front door. It came from the window behind her. Her stomach dropped. She lived alone, and her nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Slowly, she turned her head. At first, she saw nothing, just her reflection in the glass. But as she stared, a figure emerged from the shadows outside. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, or where eyes should have been, were empty voids, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The thing raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with claw-like nails, and knocked again. Megan scrambled to her feet, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The knocking continued, moving from window to window, methodical and patient. It wasn't trying to get in, yet. It was testing her. She backed into the living room, clutching a fireplace poker as her only weapon. The air felt thick, pressing down on her chest. Then the whispers began. They came from all around her, soft and garbled, like a radio stuck between stations. She couldn't understand the words, but they filled her mind, growing louder and more insistent. Megan clenched her hands over her ears, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from inside her head, worming their way into her thoughts. Through the window, she saw more figures emerging from the forest. They moved slowly, unnaturally, their bodies twisting and contorting as if their joints didn't quite work right. They surrounded the house, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. A creak from the hallway made her whirl around, her breath catching in her throat. She'd locked all the doors, hadn't she? A shadow stretched along the floor, long and jagged, creeping toward her. She stepped back, clutching the poker, her hands trembling. From the darkness of the hallway, a voice called out. "Megan." It was her voice. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The shadow grew larger, filling the room until it was all she could see. The next morning, the townsfolk found Megan's house empty. The front door was locked, and her car was still in the driveway. But her sketchbook lay on the porch, the last page filled with frantic drawings of twisted figures and hollow-eyed faces. They didn't search for her. No one ever searched for those who disappeared in Black Hollow after dark. That night, as the sun set, the forest seemed a little darker, the shadows a little longer, and somewhere deep in the woods, the whispers began again. The town of Ravenswood was known for its history, a place where time seemed to stand still. Cobblestone streets, gas-lit lamps, and Victorian-era houses gave it a charm that attracted tourists during the day. But once the sun dipped below the horizon, Ravenswood revealed its darker side, one that the locals refused to discuss. The rumors centered around the old watchtower on the edge of town. It stood tall and imposing, a relic from the 1800s when it served as a lookout during the region's tumultuous past. Abandoned for decades, the tower was an eyesore by day and a sinister silhouette by night. Cassidy, a journalist with a penchant for uncovering mysteries, arrived in Ravenswood on assignment. She'd heard about the watchtower and the stories of people who went missing near it. Determined to get the truth, she rented a room at the inn and planned to explore the tower that evening. The innkeeper, a wiry man with deep-set eyes, tried to dissuade her. "Don't go near that place," he warned. "Whatever you're looking for, it's not worth finding." Cassidy dismissed his words as small-town superstition. Armed with a flashlight, her camera, and a notebook, she made her way to the tower under the cover of twilight. The air grew colder as she approached, and the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish. When she reached the base of the tower, she noticed the heavy iron door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and creaking in the wind. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior smelled of mildew and decay, the stone walls damp and cold to the touch. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into darkness. As she climbed, the air grew heavier, each step echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Halfway up, her flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her palm, and the beam steadied. She paused to catch her breath and heard something faint above her, a low, rhythmic tapping. "Probably just an animal," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. The tapping grew louder as she ascended, accompanied by a faint whispering sound that seemed to come from all around her. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Beckoning. At the top of the stairs, she entered the watchroom. The large windows offered a view of the town below, its lights flickering like distant stars. But Cassidy's attention was drawn to the floor. A circle had been etched into the stone, intricate symbols carved deep into the surface. In the center lay a pile of bones, bleached white and arranged in a grotesque pattern. Her stomach turned, but she forced herself to take photos, the flash illuminating the room in brief bursts. As the camera clicked, she noticed something in the corner of the frame, a figure. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath quickened, and the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. She backed toward the staircase, her flashlight beam darting around the room. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the dim light. Then she saw it. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct but menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin pinpricks of malevolence. It moved toward her, its steps silent, its presence overwhelming. Cassidy turned and ran, her footsteps echoing wildly as she descended the stairs. The whispers followed her, growing into a cacophony of voices. When she reached the door, it slammed shut in her face. She pounded on it, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the whispers ceased, replaced by a low growl. She turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The figure was there, closer now, its features becoming clearer. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of human and something else entirely, its mouth filled with jagged teeth that didn't belong in this world. Cassidy screamed, her voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The next morning, the innkeeper found her camera on the steps of the tower. The photos inside showed nothing but the empty room at the top. Cassidy was never seen again, and the townsfolk continued to avoid the tower, their silence heavier than ever. They knew the truth. The tower didn't just take those who entered, it kept them. And at night, if you stood outside and listened closely, you could still hear the whispers of its victims, forever trapped in the darkness. The town of Ashford was quiet, unassuming, and utterly forgettable, except for one thing. Everyone knew about Ashford Bridge, an old wooden structure that spanned the foggy creek on the outskirts of town. It was a place of whispered legends and chilling warnings, the kind parents told their children to keep them in line. Don't go near the bridge after sunset, or the Ashford thing will find you. Of course, some dismissed the stories as nonsense. Teenagers dared each other to visit the bridge after dark, but no one ever went alone. Some claimed to hear whispers in the fog, while others swore they felt eyes watching them from the shadows. A few even said they'd seen something, a hulking figure in the mist, but no one ever stuck around long enough to confirm. Jared, a local high school senior, didn't believe a word of it. He was the skeptic of his group, always challenging the others to prove the stories wrong. When his friends refused to go with him one night, Jared decided to prove how ridiculous the tales were by going alone. Armed with nothing but his phone flashlight and a pack of cigarettes, he headed out to the bridge. The night was cold, the air heavy with mist as he approached the old structure. The wood groaned under his feet as he stepped onto the bridge, the sound eerily loud in the silence. Jared lit a cigarette, leaned against the railing, and stared into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. Nothing. He chuckled to himself, taking another drag of his cigarette. Figures, he muttered. But then he heard it. A faint sound, like someone walking through the creek below. Slow, deliberate splashes that sent a chill up his spine. Jared leaned over the railing, squinting into the fog. The water was murky, the mist making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering slightly. The splashes stopped. Jared's heart raced as he scanned the creek, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He saw nothing. Then came the whisper. It was soft at first, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. But as he stood frozen, it grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. The words were incomprehensible, garbled and layered, like a radio tuned to multiple stations at once. He took a step back, his bravado evaporating. The whispers seemed to come from all around him now, circling him, closing in. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The bridge groaned beneath him, louder than before. Jared turned to run, but the fog had thickened, disorienting him. He couldn't see the way he'd come, the other side of the bridge obscured entirely. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the mist, standing at the far end of the bridge. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping black void where its mouth should have been. Jared stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the figure moved closer. Its steps were slow, deliberate, the wood creaking beneath its weight. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, as the figure reached out a hand toward him. Its fingers were unnaturally long, ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Jared turned and ran, his feet pounding against the wooden planks. The mist seemed alive, wrapping around him, pulling at him, slowing him down. He didn't make it far. The last thing he saw was the figure towering over him, its empty mouth stretching impossibly wide. The whispers stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. The next morning, Jared's friends found his phone lying on the bridge, the screen cracked. The last photo taken showed nothing but dense fog, but some swore they could make out a shadowy figure in the corner. Jared was never seen again. The people of Ashford added his name to the growing list of those lost to the bridge. The warning remained the same: don't go near the bridge after sunset. And at night, if you stood by the creek and listened closely, you could hear the whispers, waiting. The town of Black Hollow was one of those places that time forgot, hidden deep in the woods and known only to those unlucky enough to stumble upon it. Its few residents kept to themselves, their stoic faces betraying an unspoken rule: never go out after dark. Visitors who ignored this were met with knowing glances and grim warnings. The legend revolved around the Lantern Man, a figure said to wander the dense woods surrounding the town. According to the stories, anyone who saw his flickering lantern in the dark was never seen again. Locals claimed to hear his low, mournful whistle echoing through the trees, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Lila and Marcus, avid urban explorers and self-proclaimed skeptics, had heard about Black Hollow through an online forum. Intrigued, they decided to investigate, dismissing the warnings as small-town superstition. Equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a thirst for adventure, they arrived in town late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the thick canopy of trees. The townsfolk barely acknowledged them as they parked by the old general store. When Lila asked about the Lantern Man, the storekeeper's face darkened. "You kids need to leave before nightfall," he said, his voice trembling. "The woods aren't safe. You hear a whistle, you run. You see the light, you pray." Marcus smirked as they walked out. "These people really lean into their ghost stories, huh?" Lila wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, like he truly believed it. But she shrugged it off. They had a plan. hike into the woods, snap a few eerie photos, and leave with a spooky story to share. As twilight descended, they followed a narrow, overgrown path into the forest. The air was heavy, the towering trees blocking out what little light remained. The woods were unnervingly quiet, that the usual sounds of nature eerily absent. About an hour in, they came across a clearing. In the center stood a decaying cabin, its roof sagging and windows broken. Lila snapped a few pictures while Marcus explored inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "This place is creepy as hell," he called out, his voice echoing. Lila was about to respond when she heard it, a low, melodic whistle drifting through the trees. It was faint, almost musical, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus stepped out of the cabin, his expression suddenly serious. "Yeah, probably just the wind." The whistle came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the faint sound of crunching leaves. Lila grabbed Marcus's arm. "We should go." He nodded, and they started back the way they'd come. But the path seemed different now, twisting and turning in ways neither of them remembered. The whistle followed them, growing louder, closer. Then they saw it. A faint light flickered through the trees, swaying as though carried by an unseen hand. "That's just someone messing with us," Marcus said, though his voice lacked confidence. "Who would be out here?" Lila whispered. The light moved closer, illuminating the forest in a pale, unnatural glow. As it approached, the air grew colder, and the smell of rotting wood and damp earth filled their nostrils. The lantern man emerged from the darkness. He was tall, his frame impossibly thin, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The lantern he carried cast an eerie glow, revealing long, bony fingers and a tattered coat that fluttered despite the still air. The whistle came again, this time from the figure itself, a haunting melody that seemed to worm its way into their minds. "Run!" Lila gasped, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Marcus grabbed her arm, snapping her out of her trance, and they bolted. The lantern man didn't chase them, but seemed to glide after them, his light growing brighter and his whistle louder with every step they took. They stumbled onto the path, or at least what they hoped was the path, and ran until their lungs burned. But no matter how far they went, the light never faded, always just behind them. The whistle changed, becoming shrill and discordant, almost angry. Lila tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. Marcus stopped to help her, but when they looked up, the lantern man was there, standing over them. The last thing Lila saw was the lantern swinging toward her, the light consuming everything. The next day, their car was found parked by the general store, keys still in the ignition. The locals didn't bother searching the woods. They already knew the outcome. Black Hollow remained as it always was, a quiet town with a dark secret. And at night, if you listened closely, you could hear the lantern man's whistle calling for his next victims. In the heart of Maplewood, a small town tucked away in rolling hills, stood an abandoned schoolhouse. Built in the late 1800s, it had been shuttered for decades, left to decay and fade into local legend. People whispered about strange happenings there. Lights flickering in the windows despite no electricity, children's laughter echoing in the dead of night, and shadows moving where no one should be. Lucy and her boyfriend Sam didn't believe in ghosts. They laughed at the stories, dismissing them as town lore meant to scare kids. So when a friend bet them $200 to spend a night in the old schoolhouse, they jumped at the chance. Armed with sleeping bags, flashlights, and a couple of sandwiches, they drove to the edge of town just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The schoolhouse loomed in the fading light, its weathered facade covered in ivy, windows shattered, and the front door hanging ajar. "Easy money," Sam said, grinning as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Sure," Lucy replied, though a chill crept up her spine. She wouldn't admit it, but the place unnerved her. The inside smelled of mildew and decay. Their flashlights illuminated peeling paint, broken desks, and crumbling walls covered in graffiti. They chose a classroom near the center of the building to set up camp, figuring it would be the quietest. Hours passed without incident. They played cards, shared ghost stories, and laughed at how ridiculous they all sounded. But as the clock struck midnight, things began to change. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy. Lucy shivered and zipped up her hoodie. "Did you feel that?" she asked. "Yeah," Sam muttered, glancing around. "Probably just a draft. Place is falling apart." But Lucy wasn't convinced. The silence in the schoolhouse felt oppressive, almost alive. Then they heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike. Lucy froze. Did you hear that? Sam nodded, his face pale. It's probably just an animal or something. The giggle came again, louder this time, and was followed by the sound of small, running footsteps in the hallway outside their room. Who's there? Sam called, his voice shaking. No response. Lucy's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. She slapped it, trying to steady the beam. When it stabilized, she gasped. At the far end of the room stood a child, or what looked like a child. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes gleamed like wet stones in the light. Sam, Lucy whispered, backing away. The figure didn't move, but stared at them, unblinking. Then, with a guttural groan, it bolted toward them at an impossible speed. Lucy screamed, and Sam grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the hallway. They ran blindly, their flashlights bouncing off walls and casting eerie shadows. The sound of laughter surrounded them now, echoing from every direction. They burst into the main hall, gasping for breath. The front door was in sight, but as they sprinted toward it, it slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. "Open it!" Lucy yelled, shoving Sam forward. He yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, the laughter turned into whispers, growing louder and louder until it felt like the walls themselves were speaking. "Get out!" The voices hissed in unison. The hallway stretched, elongating impossibly as the air filled with the smell of burning wood. The whispers turned to screams, and the floor beneath them began to shake. Lucy turned, and for a brief moment she saw them, dozens of shadowy figures standing just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. Children with hollow eyes and twisted grins. "Help us," one of them whispered, stepping forward. Before Lucy could react, the door flew open, and a gust of icy wind pushed them outside. They fell onto the gravel driveway, gasping and trembling. When they looked back, the schoolhouse was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. They didn't speak on the drive home. They didn't take the $200, and they never went near the schoolhouse again. But sometimes, late at night, Lucy swore she could hear faint laughter outside her bedroom window.